Picture this. It's August 1944, and a single American general is about to pull off what historians would later call one of the most audacious military maneuvers in human history. While the entire German high command believes he's sitting idle with a fake army made of inflatable tanks, George S. Patton is secretly racing across France at breakneck speed with real armor, covering distances that military experts said were impossible. In just 2 weeks, his Third Army would advance over 400 miles, liberate countless towns, and completely shatter German defensive lines. But here's what most people don't know about Patton's legendary tank campaigns. His obsession with armored warfare didn't just win battles, it fundamentally rewrote the rules of modern combat forever. Today, we're diving deep into the untold story of how one man's passionate love affair with tanks transformed the entire trajectory of World War II. You think you know Patton? Think again. We're about to uncover the strategic genius, the psychological warfare, and the revolutionary tactics that made him the most feared Allied commander on the European continent. Most history books will tell you that Patton was just another aggressive general who liked tanks. That's not just wrong, it's dangerously incomplete. The truth is far more fascinating and game-changing than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. Patton didn't just use tanks. He revolutionized how the entire world thought about mechanized warfare. His innovations in tank doctrine, combined with his almost supernatural understanding of armored psychology, created a new form of warfare that the Germans couldn't counter and the Allies couldn't replicate. Let me take you back to where it all began, because Patton's tank obsession has roots that go much deeper than most people realize. In 1916, long before World War II even started, a young cavalry officer named George Patton witnessed something that would change his life forever. At a demonstration in France, he watched his primitive tanks slowly crawl across a battlefield, crushing barbed wire and absorbing machine gun fire that would have decimated infantry. While other officers saw slow, unreliable machines, Patton saw the future warfare. He immediately recognized that these mechanical beasts could restore the mobility and shock action that had been lost in the trenches of World War I. But here's where Patton's genius really shows. He didn't just embrace tank technology. He began thinking about tanks in ways that no one else had considered. While military planners saw tanks as mobile artillery or infantry support, Patton envisioned them as the modern equivalent of cavalry charges. He understood that tanks weren't just weapons. They were psychological weapons that could break enemy morale through speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. By 1940, while America was still debating whether to enter the war, Patton was already developing tank tactics that would make him legendary. He spent countless hours studying German blitzkrieg techniques from the invasion of Poland and France, but instead of just copying what worked, he began innovating improvements. Patton realized that the Germans were making a critical mistake. They were using their tanks predictably. Their panzer divisions followed established patterns that could be anticipated and countered. Patton's revolutionary insight was that tank warfare needed to be unpredictable, psychological, and faster than anything the enemy could respond to. This is where things get really interesting, because Patton's approach to tank warfare wasn't just about mechanical superiority, it was about understanding the human element. He studied how tank crews performed under stress, how infantry reacted to armored assaults, and most importantly, how enemy commanders made decisions when facing fast-moving armored threats. Patton discovered that tank warfare was essentially psychological warfare on wheels. When America finally entered the war, Patton got his first chance to prove his theories in North Africa. The campaign in Tunisia became his testing ground for ideas that would later transform the European theater. But even his fellow American commanders didn't fully understand what Patton was doing. They saw his aggressive tank tactics as reckless and unpredictable. What they didn't realize was that being unpredictable was exactly the point. In North Africa, Patton began implementing what he called reconnaissance in force, using tank units. This wasn't just scouting, it was a completely new tactical concept. Instead of sending small units to gather information and then planning large attacks, Patton's tank forces would probe enemy positions while simultaneously being prepared to exploit any weakness they discovered. If they found a gap in enemy lines, they wouldn't report back and wait for orders. They would immediately punch through and keep going. This created a fluid, dynamic form of warfare that the German Afrika Korps had never encountered from American forces. The psychological impact on German commanders was immediate and devastating. They were accustomed to fighting British and Free French forces that followed more traditional tactical doctrines. Suddenly, they were facing an American general whose tank units seemed to operate without any predictable pattern. Patton's forces would appear where they weren't expected, attack when conventional wisdom said they should be regrouping, and disappear before German reinforcements could respond effectively. But the real breakthrough came when Patton realized something that would change everything. Tank warfare wasn't just about winning individual battles. It was about controlling the tempo of entire campaigns. Traditional military thinking held that armies advance methodically, securing supply lines and consolidating gains before moving forward. Patton understood that in the age of mechanized warfare, speed itself was a weapon that could make traditional defensive strategies obsolete. This insight led to what military historians now recognize as Patton's greatest innovation, the concept of operational tempo in armor warfare. Instead of planning tank operations day by day or even week by week, Patton began thinking in terms of sustained campaigns where his armor forces would maintain constant pressure on the enemy for months at a time. This required completely rethinking logistics, maintenance, and crew rotation for tank units. Here's what made this so revolutionary. Traditional tank doctrine assumed that armored units would advance, engage the enemy, then pull back to refit and resupply. Patton's approach kept his tank units in constant motion, supplied by mobile logistics trains that move with the armor. This meant his tank forces could maintain offensive operations far longer than anyone thought possible, and it meant that enemy commanders could never predict when or where Patton would attack next. The Germans had built their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that Allied armored forces would follow predictable patterns. They positioned their reserves and planned their counterattacks based on the belief that Allied tank units would advance to certain positions and then pause to consolidate. Patton's continuous operational tempo made all of these German defensive preparations useless. Now, let's talk about Sicily, because this is where Patton's tank innovations really started to pay off on a strategic level. The Sicily campaign in 1943 was supposed to be a methodical Allied advance up the island, with British forces taking the lead and American forces playing a supporting role. Patton had other ideas. Using tactics he had refined in North Africa, he launched his tank units on a series of rapid advances that completely outpaced the planned timeline for the campaign. But here's what most accounts of Sicily miss. Patton wasn't just being aggressive for the sake of being aggressive. He had identified a fundamental weakness in German defensive strategy. German commanders expected Allied forces to advance slowly and methodically, giving them time to organize counterattacks and reinforce threatened positions. By moving his tanks faster than German intelligence could track and faster than German reserves could respond, Patton was essentially fighting inside the German decision-making cycle. This concept, fighting inside the enemy's decision-making cycle, became central to everything Patton did with tanks for the rest of the war. Every tactical innovation, every strategic decision, every logistical arrangement was designed to ensure that his tank forces could act faster than German commanders could react. This wasn't just about having faster tanks or better crews. It was about creating a systematic approach to warfare that compressed time itself into a weapon. The Sicily campaign also revealed another aspect of Patton's genius that often gets overlooked: his understanding of terrain and how it affected tank operations. While other commanders saw Sicily's mountainous terrain as unsuitable for large-scale tank operations, Patton identified specific routes and tactics that could make armored warfare effective even in challenging topography. He pioneered the use of tank units in rapid advances along coastal roads, using naval gunfire support in ways that had never been attempted before. More importantly, Patton began developing combined arms tactics that integrated tanks with infantry, artillery, and air support in revolutionary ways. Instead of treating these as separate elements that supported each other, Patton created unified battle groups where tanks became the central organizing principle around which all other combat elements operated. This was a fundamental shift in military thinking that would influence armored warfare for decades. But it was the planning for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, where Patton's tank expertise would be put to its ultimate test. Initially, Patton wasn't even supposed to command troops in the invasion. Allied High Command had decided to use him as part of a deception operation, commanding a fictional army group to convince the Germans that the main invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. However, the deception operation itself revealed just how much the Germans feared Patton's tank tactics. German intelligence was so convinced that Patton represented the greatest Allied armored threat that they positioned their strongest panzer reserves to counter his fictional army group rather than the actual invasion forces. This tells us something crucial about how Patton's reputation had grown among German commanders. They viewed him as uniquely dangerous specifically because of his innovative approach to tank warfare. When Patton finally did get operational command in France with his Third Army, he was ready to implement everything he had learned about tank warfare on the largest scale possible. The breakout from Normandy in August 1944 became the ultimate demonstration of Patton's tank theories in action. While other Allied forces were still fighting methodical battles to advance a few miles at a time, Patton's armored spearheads were covering dozens of miles per day. Here's what made the Third Army's advance so extraordinary. It wasn't just about speed, it was about sustainability. Patton had solved the logistical puzzle of how to keep tank units supplied and operational during rapid, extended advances. His mobile supply columns, innovative maintenance procedures, and flexible command structure allowed his armored divisions to maintain their pace for weeks without significant pauses. The psychological effect on German forces was devastating. German defensive doctrine was built around the assumption that they would time to identify Allied advances, organize counterattacks, and establish new defensive lines. Patton's tank units moved so fast that German commanders were constantly reacting to situations that had already changed by the time they received reports. German reserves found themselves racing toward positions that Patton's forces had already captured and abandoned. But perhaps most importantly, Patton's tank tactics in France demonstrated something that would fundamentally change how nations thought about warfare: the concept of strategic mobility through armored operations. Traditional military thinking held that strategic objectives were achieved through the coordinated efforts of multiple army groups operating over extended periods. Patton proved that properly employed tank forces could achieve strategic objectives independently through rapid, sustained advances. The liberation of France became a masterclass in how tank warfare could accomplish political and strategic goals that went far beyond simple military victories. Every town that Patton's tanks liberated ahead of schedule was a strategic asset denied to the Germans and a psychological victory for the Allied cause. The speed of his advance meant that German forces couldn't implement their planned scorched earth tactics, preserving French infrastructure and civilian lives. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of Patton's tank innovations: his understanding of the political dimensions of mechanized warfare. Patton realized that in democratic societies fighting total wars, military operations had to achieve not just tactical success, but also political legitimacy through minimizing friendly casualties and maximizing visible progress. His tank tactics accomplished both objectives simultaneously. By the time Patton's forces reached the German border, his approach to tank warfare had evolved into something that military theorists are still studying today. He had created a form of warfare that combined the mobility of cavalry, the firepower of artillery, the psychological impact of shock troops, and the strategic reach of naval operations, all built around the tank as the central organizing principle. The final phase of the European war saw Patton's tank tactics adapted for operations inside Germany itself. Here, facing desperate German resistance and challenging urban terrain, Patton pioneered techniques for using tanks in built-up areas that contradicted everything in the tactical manuals. Instead of avoiding cities or conducting methodical siege operations, Patton developed rapid urban penetration tactics that used tanks to quickly seize key objectives within German cities. These urban tank tactics were perhaps Patton's most innovative contribution to military science. He understood that tanks in cities weren't just mobile gun platforms. They were psychological weapons that could break civilian and military morale through their mere presence. German defenders who might have fought tenaciously against infantry attacks would often surrender when faced with tanks advancing down their streets. The end result of Patton's tank innovations was a complete transformation in how the world understood mechanized warfare. Before Patton, tanks were seen as support weapons that helped infantry advance. After Patton, tanks became the foundation for entirely new forms of warfare that could achieve strategic objectives independently. His techniques influenced military doctrine not just in America, but in every major military organization worldwide. Today, nearly 80 years after World War II ended, military analysts are still discovering new aspects of Patton's tank innovations. Modern concepts like network-centric warfare, rapid dominance, and effects-based operations all have their roots in tactical principles that Patton pioneered with his tank units. His understanding that warfare in a modern era will be determined by speed, flexibility, and psychological impact proved prophetic. The true measure of Patton's impact on tank warfare isn't just that he won battles, or even that he helped win the war. It's that he fundamentally changed how humanity thinks about conflict itself. In an age where military technology is advancing at unprecedented rates, Patton's insights about the human dimensions of mechanized warfare remain as relevant as ever. So the next time someone tells you that Patton was just another aggressive general who happened to be good with tanks, remember this. He was actually a strategic revolutionary who used armored warfare to rewrite the rules of human conflict. His innovations didn't just change World War II, they changed warfare forever. And that legacy continues to shape military thinking around the world today, proving that sometimes one person's obsession really can change the course of history.